because on principle, whichever the state is and whichever the leader is, we are keeping our ambassadors in place. Now, clearly, if Kim Darroch doesn't want to stay there, he doesn't want to stay. But there is an argument that actually we should say, no, you are staying.
Which is why I had a conversation with Kim this morning about his resignation. The Foreign Secretary has been as clear as you have just been now, Mr. Seeley, in private and in public, that the question of who represents Her Majesty is for the British government, and that Sir Kim had the full support of Her Majesty's government and should stay in place until the end of his posting, which was already known to be the end of this year. So that point was made by the Foreign Secretary, but I repeat, Kim, knowing that, still decided that he should go because he did not think he would be able to do the work of a British ambassador.
You had a conversation with the Foreign Secretary about this. How many times in the past 24 hours?
I know the Foreign Secretary has spoken to Sir Kim in the last 6 hours, but I wasn't privy to the detail of the conversation.
Sorry, forgive me. We're very tight for time, and I appreciate it. Connor.
To say how dignified I thought Sir Kim's resignation letter and your response was, in contrast to the behaviour of those who forced him to resign and those who failed to defend him. You've, in your opening remarks, said he resigned because he thought he'd be a target, because of pressure on his family, because of the impact on the embassy. I mean, that would be truly shocking at a diplomatic or in a diplomatic mission in a hostile country or a country with which we have complicated relations. How difficult a challenge will it be to manage this diplomatically with a country that is one of our longest standing allies, with whom we've just exchanged state visits? How difficult a challenge is that? How unprecedented is it? How can the system respond to it if it is unprecedented?
We will respond, Mr. McGinn, because we have to. The United States is our closest ally. Across the board, in all spheres of life, we have the closest relationship with the United States. And I would add that we have a close relationship with the President of the United States, that the state visit last month, I think, was a personal success. This is at variance with that success. This is, as everybody is agreeing, unprecedented. But we will find a way through because we must.
In terms of how this unfortunate situation arose, can I ask you about confidence in two respects? Firstly, how confident are you in terms of the FCO systems around the confidentiality of communications? And secondly, how confident can our diplomats be, particularly in more difficult postings, that they will continue to be able to give unfettered and unvarnished advice to our government without it being compromised?
These are key questions for us, Mr. McGinn. We have good security systems, and we are updating those security systems, but we will look in detail at how they are functioning in the wake of what has happened this week. But I would say and stress that the systems are one thing, but the people who operate them are the key thing. And that is going also to be a focus of our work, because the human factor is the decisive one.
Can we come back to that point, if you'll forgive me, Ian?
Thank you, Chair. Can I just firstly echo Mr. McGinn's points? I think the way that Sir Kim and yourself have responded to this shows the very best of the Foreign Office, as opposed to others who should know better in terms of the way they've responded. I just wanted, while we're on process, to ask you what the process will be for appointing a new ambassador from today, and whether or not the Foreign Affairs Committee can meet that particular person.
Well, the process will be the same as for any ambassador, which is that there will be an advert, and people will apply and be interviewed, and a recommendation will be made by the Senior Appointments Board of the Foreign Office to the Foreign Secretary, and then from the Foreign Secretary to the Prime Minister. That is the standard procedure. I think it will not surprise you that the appointments to Washington don't always follow standard procedure. So I can't tell you in detail how this particular appointment will be handled, I can tell you that history shows that there are often bespoke procedures for filling the embassy in Washington, D.C.
Can I just repeat the question Mr. Murray asked, which is, can this committee meet the candidate? And I use the term candidate clearly. At the available juncture, at the appropriate juncture.
As you know, confirmation hearings are not a feature of the British system.
Didn't ask
but
for
I note the committee's interest, indeed enthusiasm, and shall discuss this with the Foreign Secretary.
Thank you. Mr. Gethens.
Yeah, can I reflect the views of my colleagues and thank you for the handling of this and how sorry I am to see the ambassador leave. I think it's particularly concerning that it would be good to get your remarks about the impartiality of the civil service, which is so important. And I was sorry to see, for example, the former Foreign Secretary not defend that a little bit more strongly yesterday. Can I ask, how important is candour in the missives that you get back from your ambassadors anywhere in the world?
It is vitally important, Mr. Gethens. It's the only way we can work. The tradition in the British diplomatic service is openness within the diplomatic service. We have always believed in sharing the necessary information with all officials who needed to know. And over decades, that system has served us well. But clearly, right now, it is under unprecedented pressure.
Your message to ambassadors elsewhere in the world who are reporting back from what I would have thought previously to be even more difficult circumstances than those in Washington, I would have thought up until the events of the past few days. What is your message to those ambassadors in terms of the protections that they should expect?
I have already been in touch with all the ambassadors this week, stressing that unvarnished, honest analysis is what we need, is what officials need in order to give the best possible advice to ministers so that their decisions can be as good and as evidence-based as possible. I think we're going to do a lot of soul-searching, and this session, I hope, will feed into that. One thing that is under our control is the distribution lists that receive our most sensitive reporting. And so the person drafting has control about how wide that readership should be. Diplomatic telegram, with which Ms. Patel is very familiar, goes to a wide readership. But emails and emailed letters go to a much more targeted audience.
Finally, Mr. Chairman, what would your message be to the leaker about the damage that this has done in terms of the day-to-day work of the Foreign Office?
That the leaker is guilty of the worst breach of trust in our service in my career. The damage after 3 days is evident in the resignation of the most senior British diplomat.
Can we just come very quickly onto the distribution of these particular messages? Am I right in understanding they fall into different categories, as you have just described? So some of them are what you call diptels, and some of them are what you call emailed letters. The letters in the particular case that we're discussing now, how many people did they go to?
This, Mr. Chairman, is already part of the investigation. You are right, there is a mix, and because the mix includes emailed letters, that is a line of active enquiry. But the team running it is using that information right now.
I understand if you don't have an immediate answer to it, but you're okay. And is there any way of knowing who has read or opened an email on the Firecrest system?
I will turn to an expert.
So on that, I think I have to be careful exactly what I say, but we do monitor traffic on the Firecrest network, yes.
Pretty, you wanted to comment?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much. And I echo, obviously, the views of others about Sir Kim's resignation today. In light of the leak inquiry that has now taken place and the fact that there has been a leak and there's been sensitive communications put out in the public domain, have concerns over recent months and perhaps the last few years been raised at all about any potential leaks, any risks on any data or telegrams or diptels going out into the public domain, and anything regarding cybersecurity and obviously distribution lists, which of course, as Simon, you've already said, are quite wide and vast. Bear in mind the scale of the network too. Have any concerns been raised, either, if not from ministers, but from diplomats themselves, in mission, in embassies, regarding security and some of the potential exposure of very confidential and sensitive information?
These considerations, Ms. Patel, are always on our mind, and as you point out, the challenge has changed in recent years. That computer hacking is a relatively recent phenomenon. Our need to be able to defend ourselves in cyberspace is a relatively new phenomenon. And our experts are active to defend our systems. And we have made progress, but I repeat that no matter how good the systems, the people who operate them are the key. And generally, when we have suffered a leak, it has been because a person has consciously done something wrong.
Just on that basis, I mean, very specifically and directly, has Sir Kim ever raised any issues around sensitivity, secure information, or any risks from the Washington end, from our mission there, about any potential risks or threat on information being leaked? Bear in mind as well, obviously, the political climate in Washington, many of the other wider stories outside of HMG's footprint around cyber security, hacking, around the administration, and around the US elections that took place a few years ago.
To the best of my knowledge, Ms. Patel, no, that he has had confidence in the systems and in the people operating them. Until 4 days ago, that was confidence that had been rewarded, but no more.
And just finally from me, I mean, obviously things will change off the back of what has happened. There's no doubt about that. You'll have the leak inquiry. But in terms of staff, I come back to civil servants and diplomats who do exceptional work. I've had the privilege of working with many of our ambassadors around the world. What message are you sending to them right now? Because obviously they've seen one of the most exceptional diplomats resign from office over some very sensitive communications that have been leaked. In terms of rebuilding confidence and trust in the system with people who are thousands of miles away from London right now, feeling quite remote from HMG, what do you see your role in trying to instill confidence and give them reassurance actually about their own roles and the ability to be pretty candid in the information that they're sending back to London?
This is an exceptional moment. So I have already convened today an all-staff meeting at 4 o'clock. So I will tell you now what I will tell my colleagues later. This is a personal tragedy for a friend and colleague. This is something which will make us look at our ways of working again. But I will give them one big assurance that we will pursue the culprit with all means at our disposal, because it is very important that the person is caught. And second, I will encourage them to continue to work in the necessary traditional way, that we can't serve our Secretaries of State if we start concealing key information. But I will encourage them to think more carefully, even more carefully, about how they transmit their most sensitive information.
Can I jump in just for a moment? You say that Sir Kim has raised no concerns.
To the best of my knowledge.
To the best of your knowledge, absolutely. I have a Sunday Times article from the 13th of November 2016, which is the full publication of one of Sir Kim's diptels. And it was written up by Tim Shipman on the day. Is there a pattern of leaking from the US Embassy?
From the embassy in Washington?
Yeah.
As I sit here, I don't think there is a pattern of leaking. I know there have been leaks from Washington that afflicted previous ambassadors, not just Sir Kim. But a diptel is the communication that goes to the widest audience. And so even though the diptel you have is from Washington, just the fact that it is from Washington doesn't indicate that it was leaked in Washington.
So can we go back to the numbers question? Of the more sensitive letters, are you assuming a readership in the 5, 10 sort of numbers, or are you assuming a readership of larger than that?
The most sensitive do have distributions of 5 to 10 at the bottom end. But every communication these days is electronic, and every machine has a forward button.
Every machine has a forward button.
All computers have a forward button, Mr. Chairman.
Some of the military systems don't.
So please.
Oh, sorry.
So, may I add on that? The forward button may be within a controlled system. So, for example, our secret system, you can't forward outside that secret domain. And as you would imagine, the auditing functions on that are stronger than they are on official or official sensitive systems.
Royston.
Can I talk about sanctions for the culprit? Because the tragedy here is the ambassador who's done his job admirably and said exactly what he should have said in reporting to government. But the person that's leaked this is the one that we would all like to see brought to justice, if that's the right word. Now, I don't know what the sanctions are. I suspect if you were leaking intelligence to a foreign body while we're at a moment of national crisis, they'd be far worse than they would under these circumstances. But what are the sanctions for the culprit, and are they strong enough to deter anyone from doing it again in the future? Because this is becoming something now that we see, if it's not routinely, it's becoming that way, and it needs to be stopped.
There are a range of sanctions, up to and including summary dismissal. If a criminal case can be made, well then it will be turned over to the Director for Public Prosecutions.
Have you already called the police?
The police are involved.
Chris?
Well, I think it's the Official Secrets Act, isn't it? Can I just check, first of all, there's no public interest defence, is there, in the Official Secrets Act? You can't say, oh, I'm a whistleblower.
I am not a lawyer. I do not think there is a public interest
I think
defence
it's
in
only
this case.
up to 6 months, isn't it? Imprisonment is the maximum.
2 years. I believe it's maximum.
Right. Okay.
Can I give penalty for breaching the trust of the British people?
You've said, you've referred repeatedly to leaker. I presume it's either a leak or a hack. Have you discounted hack now?
As the Foreign Secretary said on Monday, there's no evidence of a hack, but we have not excluded that. This is an open investigation.
Is it at all possible that the United States might have intercepted the communication themselves?
My personal view is no. We have a very close relationship with the United States. We do not spy on each other.
What's morale like in the Foreign Office at the moment?
I think people are shaken by what has happened. There is a reason why I have asked to see all my colleagues at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The basis on which we have worked all our careers suddenly feels as though it is challenged. So I think there is a need for reassurance and reflection, but the reflection needs to include all the things the committee is talking about how we handle secure information and the systems on which they are transmitted.
Doesn't the British political establishment have to stand absolutely shoulder to shoulder with the British ambassador in a moment like this? Every single element of it?
I would say yes, and my colleagues have noted what the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have said with gratitude.
And just one other question. It feels sometimes a bit as if the UK is being targeted by the American president. I thought actually the most humiliating sentence of the week was the bit about the president told the Prime Minister how to do Brexit, and then referred to her as foolish. And then there are attacks on the mayor of...
Stop you, Mr. Wright. We're not doing an investigation into the Anglo-US
No, but
relations.
the only question for me is whether this we need to recalibrate our relationship because of this process.
The relationship with the United States is so deep and so wide that it will withstand any individual squall.
Move on from that because we want to focus very much on the handling of information.
A couple of quick questions then on that point, if I could, Sir Simon. Can I just say, politicians don't sign the Official Secrets Act, do they? So if the Official Secrets Act was going to be used, it would be used against a soldier or a diplomat who had leaked these. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
Okay.
Ministers have to sign the Official Secrets Act.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Do the ministers sign?
I have my Director of Security sitting next to me.
I'm not certain. Obviously, subject to the ministerial code, but we can write back and confirm.
The ministerial code isn't breaking the law, it's breaking the ministerial code. So you wouldn't be if a politician had leaked this, he or she wouldn't be prosecuted because they've
You don't have to agree to Acts of Parliament. Acts of Parliament are binding on you whether you agree to them or not. Signing the Official Secrets Act merely reminds you that you are bound by it. It doesn't change
Does it not
the
make
law.
it Mr. Chairman, does it not make it a criminal act? That's what I'm saying.
Criminal act, whether you've signed the Official Secrets Act or not, in the same way as murder is a criminal act, whether or not you've signed the Murder Act.
I believe the Chairman is correct, but I can write and confirm that. There's a different process, but you notify somebody, which means that it's easier to prove that they've broken that act because they've been notified of their responsibilities under it. But it doesn't necessarily, the law doesn't only apply to those people. But we can confirm that.
The classifications used for the communications to and from diplomats overseas. There are diptails which are on Firecrest. Were the emails sent under a Firecrest or a secure system as well?
So I think, I think we're not going to comment on the details of this particular investigation at the moment. Obviously, we can answer generically the different systems which are used for communication.
Do you? Sorry.
I was going to say, maybe say, without commenting on the specifics of this case, there are different levels of classification. They are official, secret and top secret, and we have different IT systems for those different levels of classification.
Moving on, is the FCO's policy on classification fit for purpose? I have never had the privilege of working for the FCO, but I did once upon a time have access to a Firecrest account, and I was told basically, don't put anything sensitive on it because the Russians read it. So if I'm told that Firecrest is hackable and easy to read, are you confident that Firecrest in this day and age has the level of security that you would wish to associate with it and to make sure that your communications are not hackable? It makes them less hackable.
So there are different threats here. There are threats against espionage and hacking, and there are threats against leaks and our stuff. So Firecrest is a more vulnerable system. It's at the official level. It's highly resilient in terms of attacks against it. But there are certain communications you then want to record it secret. But we have that system. In fact, we have a new government-wide system which we've been rolling out over the last year with probably the biggest uptake of that secret level system, which also, because it's Whitehall-wide, enables us to share information very confidently across the whole of government.
Do you see any reason to revise this and what you're doing in the systems that you're using in light of what's happened?
So
we constantly look at our systems. As I say, I don't want to say too much about that, but we do monitor the system. We use the 3-tier system to protect very sensitive information according to the government security classification, the official, secret, top secret, the definitions of which are on the internet. But I would say also, as Sir Simon has said earlier, that this comes down to individual use of that, and ultimately no system could be 100% secure if people use it. Right?
System allow the sender to disable the forward function.
So, as Mr. Hobart said, that there are different ways that we do that on different systems. It's about keeping information within the environment of the people who have access to that system at the appropriate classification levels.
So long as you are at the appropriate classification level, you can forward anything to anyone.
So you can forward information to people within systems who need to see it. Then various procedures come into play. So when anybody signs up to to use the FIFO system, for example, they have to sign security operating procedures, and they contain information about how to use things within that system, such as only forwarding things to people if they have a real business need to know.
Is that a bit like the terms and conditions that you tick the box and click accept, or is it?
Well, it does involve training, both to use a standard system, the official system, or to use the secret system or the top secret system. All of those involve different training levels, and they have more constraints over what you can and can't send and who you can send it to.
Taking a picture of the screen.
So where our secret and top secret systems are, you generally are not allowed to have any mobile or photographic devices in those areas.
And printing?
I don't want to go too much into the details of the security of our systems, but as the systems become more secure, the capability to protect them and the constraints on the user are greater.
So generally not allowed to take your telephone in, but you could?
Well, you'd be explicitly breaking rules, regulations, things which are monitored, and it's monitored.
Because obviously anyone that's leaking are breaking all the rules, so we've established that, but it's monitored so that you can't take your telephone in.
There are different ways that we monitor that in different places, depending on the risk.
Pretty, you wanted to come in? No? Ian?
Can I just ask, I mean, we don't want to go into the leak itself, because obviously you've just launched the inquiry, but what classification did this message have?
Well, that's part of the inquiry, Mr. Murray. So, I mean, all of this will be part of the report, but this will come out later.
A more general question, hypothetical question, of course, but what damage would it do to every foreign mission across the world if the leak inquiry was to conclude that it was politically motivated?
Well, I assume in those circumstances, Mr. Murray, that we would have a complete story, and that the complete story would give us, indicate what we needed to do next in order to prevent a repetition.
And just following that up, and a short follow-up from my previous question, what systems and checks and balances are in place at the Foreign Office with an ambassadorial appointment of such importance, if that next ambassadorial appointment was a political appointee?
As the committee knows, we have one political appointee in the network, who is Lord Llewellyn, the ambassador at Paris. As a British ambassador, he is treated as part of the FCO organisation. He is treated in no different way.
Which I might add includes going through vetting procedures in order to see classified information and work in classified areas.
So a political appointee would still have to go through the same rigorous checks and balances as someone who would go through that advertising and application process?
To get access to classified information, yes.
Not to be appointed. But not to be appointed. Or they would... Mr. Murray's asking whether or not any political appointee would have to go through similar scrutiny.
A political appointee, by definition, is made by the Prime Minister, and she or he will name the person. But then to do the job, to have access to the information to do the job, that person is subject to security procedures, but that happens after the nomination.
If a nomination was made and an individual didn't pass those security procedures, do they stay in post, or are they therefore barred from being in that position?
To my knowledge, that has not happened. If it were to happen, Mr. Murray, I foresee a difficult conversation for myself with the Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Bryant.
Some newspapers have suggested that there is more to come. Now, I don't know whether they mean more to come in relation to the United States of America or other places, because obviously other information has been leaked in other places in recent years, or hacked, I think. I just wonder whether you expect that, and what you're doing to make sure that we are protected against that.
I've seen the same press reports, so as you acknowledge, it's entirely speculative as to what it means. I'm just bracing myself.
So you fear that there may be more?
I fear there may be more.
In relation to the United States of America or elsewhere, you don't know?
I do not know.
It's just what the press have read. Just one other thing, about political appointees. This committee's been to see Lord Llewellyn, and I think we were very impressed by the way he was performing his duties. They obviously have a place, but they're relatively rare in the British system, but they're entirely common in the American system. Is there a clash here?
Different countries do this in different ways. I was ambassador to Israel, and their law allows up to 11 political appointees at any one time. As you know, the United States is between 1/3 and 1/2 at any one time. In the United Kingdom, it has generally been 0, 1, or 2. Right now, it is just one person. But it's something that is familiar for many decades.
But it's tended to be High Commissioners, hasn't it?
Latterly, the High Commissioner to Australia has been a politician on, I think, 3 occasions in the last 20 years.
South Africa.
South Africa as well, but also to the United Nations in New York. Lord Richard was the political appointee.
Can we move on? Forgive me, again, conscious of time. Can I just ask some quite specific questions? Do you believe that your diplomatic staff are now confident that their communications are secure?
So I think that they understand that there's a human risk, as Sir Simon has pointed out, and therefore the importance of controlling distribution lists. And that was a message which Simon reinforced again on Monday. And also not pressing the forward button. One of our rules is if you want to press the forward button because you think somebody else needs to know it, you check with the person that sent it as well, because maybe they do and maybe that's fine. I think people understand the systems reasonably well and they know what risks there are. This has been an exceptional week.
And I hear what you're saying about informing staff and getting teams together, but what immediate actions are you planning to take to ensure the confidence of staff overseas? Because this isn't just about the way that they handle information, it's also about the way that they're supported should that information come out.
Well, the investigation is a very important part of reassurance, and that is it's being taken as serious as it can be taken. But another part is the new system, which
the Foxhound system.
Yes, now called ROSA. And that has already been rolled out. It's critically important to what happens next.
Celia.
Just very quickly on this, I mean, looking at the leaks themselves, I don't know if you're in a position to comment, it doesn't strike me as being a sort of Chelsea Manning style massive data breach, because they are a mixture of things, and it looks more likely that somebody has got hold of some emails and some diptels rather than a larger dump of information.
I note your view, but forgive me for not commenting on it.
Can I just 1 second, sorry, have you had any communications with the US Embassy here about recent days?
I have had a meeting with the US chargé, yes.
Interview, no coffee, or?
It was a diplomatic encounter.
Was it a free and fair exchange of views, free and frank exchange of views, sorry?
I would not dispute the characterisation.
That is a Mandarin.
Mandarin for yes.
Chair, thank you. Thanks. So Simon, I'd like to come on to the inquiry itself. Obviously there's a structure around this inquiry. I'd like to ask some very basic factual questions, if I may, around who will be conducting the inquiry, what are the terms of reference for the inquiry as well, and in particular, who will they be reporting to? Bear in mind, obviously, you are the head of the Foreign Office, but also there's going to be a bit of transition over the next few weeks as well, with a change in Prime Minister. And are you anticipating the formal end result, a report of some sort, to be published fully Or are you going to wait and see what the actual inquiry just surfaces before you think about what will be published, what will be redacted, and what information could go in the public domain?
These are all good and essential questions, Ms. Patel, but I'm going to look to Mr. Hobart to give what we can say at this point.
So the Cabinet Office are leading the inquiry, working obviously with my team and others. Ultimately, the inquiry will report to the Cabinet Secretary. I can't really comment on the terms of reference, and in terms of a report, I think it will depend where the inquiry goes. I think that may not have answered your questions. Was there anything very obvious I didn't?
In terms of what you can answer right now, are you able to even allude to or indicate in terms of people that will be involved in the inquiry itself? So, for example, Sir Simon, you've already mentioned the police being notified. Are you likely to include serving and foreign ministers, for example, in this inquiry? There's been some changes over the years and, in fact, weeks and months in terms of ministers too. And are you effectively going to be, I know you can't talk about terms of reference, but is that something that's under active consideration? And are you able to say anything around if they refuse to participate, what kind of actions will be taken?
I note, Ms. Patel, that your question is really in the form of a suggestion. So we note what you said and we'll share this with the inquiry.
Committee meet whoever is leading the inquiry.
We will discuss that. I will discuss that with the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. We'd be very grateful. Mr. Seeley.
Just finally on this, do you have any sort of time lengths in mind? Are you looking to get an interim report in the month? Are you going to be coming back in 6 months' time saying, well, we're still looking at things?
So it's only 3 days in, so we really don't have that scoped out yet. It depends where the initial leads take us.
I think that's an important...
There is a sense of urgency, be assured.
If you don't find out something in the next 2 to 3 weeks, you're going to come back and say, we're still looking, here's interim findings, or is there going to be radio silence until you come out with a final conclusion?
I really think it's too early to say. I know that Simon's made an undertaking to come back later on, but it's on future date.
You know you'll be back.
I know I will.
Not just, but on this subject.
Exactly. So Simon, the 2016 article that I highlighted earlier was clearly a leak. What was the inquiry that followed up from that?
I do not have that specific article or cable in front of me, but I will write to you and let you know.
Thank you. I'd be very grateful because it would be more than a shame for this culture to endure. Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Just one last question. I want to try and pursue a little bit about these political appointments, if I may. Can you just give us maybe a flavour of the top 4 or 5 specifications that you would have in an advert for the UK's top political ambassadorial job in America?
Well, there is a distinction, Mr. Murray, between political appointees and ambassadors for which we advertise externally. A political appointee is made on the decision of the Prime Minister. This is allowed by the CRAG of 2010. Right now we have just one, as I've mentioned, Lord Llewellyn. We also have the option of advertising externally, which we do from time to time, most recently last month, where we put an advert in The Economist and the Financial Times for 3 senior ambassadorships and 1 governorship. So right now there are live competitions for the ambassadors at Luxembourg, Kuwait and Seoul, and for the governorship of Gibraltar. Those initial competitions close later this month, and then there will be a process in which internal candidates will be considered alongside external, and a recommendation will be made to the Foreign Secretary.
So it will take a specification in the job that says that the...
External ones, yes, there is a job description, so possible candidates can see the skills, competencies we're looking for as whether or not to apply. So that is a part of the process, but a purely political process does not include that.
So the specification to put in a non-Remainer who wants a trade deal with America, which has just been tweeted by someone who has already tipped himself for the post, would not be part of those specifications for the job?
That would not be part of the FCO's specifications.
Thank you. That's all I need to do.
Can I just ask about the nature of dictals? Do you write them for FCO staff? Do you write them for ministers? Do you write them for both? Or do you write them so that diplomats here can shape opinions and give ministers options? So who's our ultimate audience?
I've been an ambassador twice, Mr. Seeley, and dictals were a key part of communication. When you wanted to get information widely through the system. So diptels are a form of communication that's shared around Whitehall. So it's generally information that is not particularly sensitive, but which is not being picked up in the main media, and which British officials will benefit from knowing.
Are there periods in our history where you feel that diplomats have had to be more politically astute? I'm thinking maybe the ambassadors in Berlin and Moscow in America in the 1930s and 40s, where you were writing whether tumultuous changes taking place in those countries, but also back in the UK when you're writing for a political culture which might have been out of step with what the Foreign Office thought was happening or thought would happen.
I think our duty as public servants is clear no matter the government of the day. The definition of a public servant is someone who can work for whatever government the people elect.
That culture has always been consistent through periods of our history where there have been significant political changes either here or abroad in those countries.
My reading of our history is yes, we have consistently sought to give an objective, impartial and honest stream of advice.
Well, maybe Sir Neville Henderson in Berlin in the late 1930s was seeking to please Sir Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler at the same time rather too much to be able to give candid and proper advice. But anyway, I just wanted to ask about the political appointments, because I didn't quite understand what you said earlier. When it's in a political appointment, is it just that it's an idea that springs up in the Prime Minister's mind, I'm going to appoint X, or is there a formal process, A, where one decides this is going to be a political appointment, not a traditional one, not a diplomatic service one, and then there's a second process whereby there's an advert and they decide on who that political appointee is going to be, or is it just a decision in the head of them?
My experience of political appointees is that the Prime Minister decided Mrs. May has not done this, wanted to make a political appointment with a person in mind.
Right.
And so there is no advert, there's no job spec. It goes through the system in a different and quicker way. The advert I talked about is not a political appointment.
Right.
It's just it's an appointment on merit, but seeking a wider selection of candidates.
Under the CRAG Act.
Because
it applies to all civil servant appointments of civil servants from outside the civil service.
Yeah.
Can I? And just then, in this moment now, you are intending to start the process for the Washington Post in the normal, conventional diplomatic service way.
So Kim resigned less than 3 hours ago,
yeah.
And he is available to serve. He's not disappearing from Washington immediately. I will discuss that process with the Foreign Secretary as soon as I see him.
Right. In just over 3 months, we're making a fundamental change to our foreign policy laydown. Are you confident that the Foreign Office is correctly structured and has the appropriate systems to manage an international network at a time that has never been more important to the United Kingdom?
We are working on it, Mr. Chair. In the last 2 years, we have expanded that network. So we have returned particularly to some Commonwealth countries from which we had withdrawn in the first decade of this century. So when this expansion is complete, which will be by the end of next year, we will have missions in 161 countries. So we will have the biggest network of any European country.
I appreciate what you're saying, but that's a numerical answer to a qualitative question. Whether or not the Foreign Office is ready is as much a question about morale in the mission in Washington and Paris as it is about the number of missions we may have in sub-Saharan Africa. Are you confident that those we send abroad and ask to undertake some of the most important jobs on behalf of the British people are appropriately supported, resourced and encouraged to take on those roles and to deliver the best that they can for Britain?
Yes, but we have more work to do. We had our leadership conference in London last month when all heads of mission returned to London. And my reading of the mood was that morale was quite high. People like a serious job of work to do, and we surely have a serious job of work to do.
You do. Can I close this session by, first of all, thanking you for coming at incredibly short notice and for giving us an hour of your time. I'm extremely grateful. And I secondly ask, on behalf of the committee, for you to pass on our very deep gratitude to Sir Kim, not just for his 4 years in Washington, but his 30 or more years in the service. 42 years, there you go. I was 3 when he joined the Foreign Office. For his 42 years serving our country in any number of different posts with enormous distinction, great personal courage and great distinction. Could you also please pass on to your entire staff our very deep gratitude for the work that they do and our respect for their endeavours. I know this is a hard time for them and we are grateful.
I shall do the first when I speak to Sir Kim later and the second when I see my colleagues at 4 o'clock.
Thank you very much. Order, order.